Hello artists. Today we're going to look at a few tips for editing a digital image of a physical artwork. So hopefully at this point you've already taken a great photo of your artwork, one that's well lit. I've actually got two here to compare for you. This is the artwork that I'll be working with today. And it should look something like this, right? Relatively crisp. The edges are kind of parallel to the frame of the photo, so there's no warping necessary because you held the camera right over the center of that artwork. By the way, the reason why I've got two images today is to show you a little bit about lighting. One thing I mentioned in my tips is that you want as much light as possible. However, there is an exception. If you notice on the right here, I've got this sort of awkward shadow cast from my body holding the camera. This is because I had too many room lights on. On the left, I only use natural light from the window. So sometimes turning on all the lights is helpful, but if it casts these problematic shadows, you might have to try moving your artwork vertically, like up against a surface, and that might get rid of it. Otherwise, like I said, try and get to a window. That's always the best option. So let's work with this image here. It's ready to go. So first step is to crop or rotate, and I'm using Preview, the default photo viewing and editing app on a Mac, but pretty much all free programs or apps will have similar features. You just have to tinker to find them. So if you do need to rotate your image, you might find a shortcut like this. You might go to Tools, and you can rotate over here. I don't really need to do anything, so I'm going to go ahead and crop. On Preview, you just drag the selection. And generally the goal is to remove the background. Now if cutting off a small edge causes a problem, like let's say there was text there or important visual information, you might need to keep some of that background for now and work with more sophisticated editing tips later. Okay. You also can make some artistic decisions. Like I have a little bit more negative space in the bottom than I think I need, so I might actually crop off a bit more, and that's totally fine. So for Preview, I'm just going to do Command K is the shortcut for crop. And now I've cropped my image, okay? Step 2 is to adjust levels. So levels really have to do with contrast, light, and dark. So here in Preview, if I go to adjust color, you'll often see a graph that looks like this, similar to if you use Photoshop or a similar program. Now these basically represent the range of values and colors in your artwork. And you can see here I've got these sliders. So a good rule of thumb for starting is to pull the sliders towards the base of these mountains that you see. So you can see I'm making the lights a little bit lighter. I'm going to stop at the base of the mountain. And my darks a little bit darker. That's going to bring it to true black. However, that's not a golden rule. That's a good place to start. You can see this image, doesn't look great. I think I took this too far. So you can kind of use your judgment, but we're going to adjust these sliders to get that contrast as similar as possible to the original drawing. If you have a middle slider, that's going to adjust the midtones or the grays. So you can sort of tinker with this until it feels natural. And again, don't overdo it, otherwise you'll get this super high contrast version, which might look cool, but is not really good representation of your artwork. All right, let's start with that. Okay. So now I've adjusted my levels. It's got a little bit more contrast, okay? Next, I'm going to do some color correction if needed. Now again, you don't always need to do either of these steps, it just depends on the quality of your original image. So two things to look for are temperature, which switches between cool and warm tones. So cool, right, blue, green, purple, warm, red, orange, yellow, like fire. So sometimes the lighting in your room might change the colors in a bad way. So you can slide this temperature control to make it cooler or warmer. It's kind of fun to play with actually. And again, mine were actually pretty accurate, so I'm not going to make a big difference, just a subtle adjustment there. Make it a bit cooler. You can also play with saturation. If your image was more saturated, the color was more vibrant than the photo, you can boost that a little bit. You can see that blue in the background getting more intense. Or if you have a black and white photo, you maybe take away all the saturation to keep it nice and clean and even. So you can also mess with saturation, which is again the power of the hue of your color. This feels about right for mine. My spray paint in the background was pretty subtle here. All right, so we've cropped, we've adjusted levels, we've color corrected. Essentially this is ready to go. Now when you save, you could just go File Save like this. This will override the original file, which could be a little bit dangerous. If you went too far with your editing and you realize that later, you now don't have access easily to that original file. So when possible, I would duplicate it or do save as to create a new file. With preview, you can do export. Push that quality all the way up. JPEG is of course a standard image file, and you can change the image name if you want. Let's call this one Edit Party. All right, so I'm going to save that to my desktop, and this is good to go. Now the last step for editing is to consider adding a border. You could actually add a border permanently in some of these editing apps or in Photoshop, but this is something I usually just do inside my digital portfolio. So whether it's a Google slideshow or a website, there's usually options to add borders. So just to show you what I mean, let's go to this fake portfolio. So let's say I have an artwork here, boom, just like that. And I want to add a border to it. So in slides, at least, you can choose the border weight, and you can choose the border color. I like black personally. So you can play around this, and this is really personal preference, but I think having at least a thin border really helps kind of anchor your photo and make it look a little bit more professional. So that's it. Hopefully this was helpful, and next I'll be showing you how to do the same thing a little bit quicker using an iPhone or something similar. Adios. Alright everyone, we're going to now look at those same exact photo editing tips just using a phone. Now I'm using an iPhone, but all these default photo editing apps have very similar features. So you might have to tinker around again, but you should be able to find something very similar regardless of the phone that you're using. So let's get started. I'm going to zoom in here. Yoink. Alright, so here's that same image. So the first thing I want to do is hit edit, and we're going to crop. So there's my crop button on the bottom. And there's a few ways you can do this. You can zoom in, you can carefully grab the edge and sort of pull the corners in. And I'm sort of checking to make sure that the negative space is absent, right? Meaning there's nothing in the background. If I need to crop just a little bit more, I'll do so. If you need to rotate, you can tap these up here. Okay. Next is levels. Now, on most of these apps, you're not going to see that same diagram we saw in preview with the mountains, but we have lots of options that essentially do the same thing. So I'm going to tap on this editing button here, and I have all these buttons to play with. You can experiment with them, but my suggestion is to start with exposure and contrast. Now exposure is a good start. Oops, there it is, one of the first ones, because this talks about just the general lightness or darkness. So if you notice that your whole image is a little light or a little dark, exposure is a good way to start. The other one I like to tinker with is contrast. Oops, this one here. Which again, this does what we were doing with those mountains. It lightens the lights and it darkens the darks. So if I increase contrast, it's going to do those two things simultaneously. And if I decrease, it will move everything sort of towards middle grays. So again, you want to find the sweet spot that looks as close as possible to the original. It's typically good to have some true whites. If you had white paper, I like to compare the white on my screen to something that's pure white, like these icons, to give you a sense of that accuracy and contrast. Now last is color. So if I slide over, I want to look at that saturation and temperature adjustment. So saturation's right here. Again, this is how intense the hue of the color is. So you can pump that up if you need things to be a little bit more intense, or you can bring it down, especially if you have black and white drawings. Again, this will make sure that they're truly black and white, or you might just need to make your colors less vibrant. And then last but not least is temperature, which conveniently looks like a little thermometer. So again, one way will give us warmer temperature, moving towards oranges, and the other will go cooler, moving towards kind of blues and purples and greens. So you want to find that sweet spot that feels close to the original. Okay, now I'm going to hit done. You can use the share function to save this as a separate file, but most phones, especially iPhones, will give you the option to revert. So if you ever decide that you want to go back to the original or start over, if you go back to edit, you can hit this revert button and it will bring back the original photo, just in case you need to do that. There it is. All right, have fun. Adios. Whoosh.